Gary Jobson, welcome to Sailforth 250. What a great event, and who doesn't love a birthday party, particularly a 250th birthday party? We're joined today here by a real expert on maritime history, Dr. Tara Ryder. She's a professor at Stony Brook University out on the end of Long Island, served in the United States Coast Guard, loves everything maritime, and I must guess she must have loved going to school with getting a PhD. You know, we look at these ships that are touring the harbor and going up and down, and they look beautiful and they look romantic. But even in the early days, there was a lot of science behind these boats because they wanted to survive, they wanted to get their mission done, and they wanted to get back. So there must have been a lot of interesting people building and designing these ships so that the sailors could be able to handle them.
You really have to think about just how many different moving parts there were to a vessel successfully going out to sea, from the designers, the builders, to iron workers for all of the nails that were needed, sail makers, rope makers, coopers for all of the barrels to carry all of the supplies, and then also simply gathering a crew to be able to go out on these voyages. And again, early on, if you go back, you know, this was a world that was dangerous. And so the question of who was going to return, would that vessel make it?
So you had to have crew that were skilled at being at sea, but a lot of them were probably pretty new to it.
So this is where you get the term green hands. That's often coming from the fact that, you know, these were landlubbers going out to sea for the first time, and they might turn a little green. But there's also just the years that it takes to have experience. So you had ordinary seamen kind of above the green hands, and then an able-bodied seaman was the most important sailor on board. They were the ones who knew every part of that vessel. They knew where that line went, and before a captain could really even finish an order, they were already putting it into place. And then of course you had all of your officers.
So being a leader was hard work. You had to get everybody working for you. Discipline was important, yet you didn't want to be overbearing. You know, we've all seen the film Mutiny on the Bounty, and we know Captain Bligh, and you know, there's a lot of trauma that happened out at sea. But I'm guessing it probably wasn't like that. It must have been more of a community or brotherhood, or was it really separated between the officers and the people working the deck?
First of all, it depended very much on the vessel itself. Each vessel had, to a certain degree, its own personality, and that included kind of what that very homogenous society looked like. You are looking at an all-male crew for the most part. Most of them would have been young men. If we think about sailors going back to the 1400s, even into the 1800s, this is a physically demanding job. And so typically you'd be in your 20s, 30s, you're going to age out at a certain point. But again, you often depended on, in the navies, there was a lot more structure. It was a lot more, we could argue, brutal. But on merchant vessels, it really was a matter of kind of the captain's attitude. So you had some that we would see as much more comrades working together, others in which you have that very strict hierarchy going on. And it really came down to survival, what was going to work best.
I've been across the Atlantic Ocean 6 times on vessels, and every time I've done it, it seems to take about 14 to 17 days, whether I'm on a sailing vessel or a merchant vessel. How long were these boats out there at sea?
So crossing over, if you were going from Europe to the Americas in, say, the 1500s, 1600s, you were looking at anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to even longer, depending on the weather. So you're out there for months at a time. And so again, you have to think about, as large as these vessels look, how small they really were when you think about the amount of space you have to move during that time frame.
It's fascinating reading ship's logs. You know, people have very intricate handwriting, but they put a lot in the ship's logs and told you what's going on. And importantly, they told us what life was like aboard these boats. And it seemed like these ships had a very different personality, and it all started with the captain.
The captain very much kind of set the tone for what this vessel was going to be like. And so some of them were incredibly strict, very, very conscientious about that idea of hierarchy. Officers were not mixing with the typical sailor. Others, it depended a little bit more, maybe a little bit more flexibility. Typically, if there was a smaller crew, you might have a closer working relationship. Probably the ones where we see the most structure was coming out of the Navy. And again, this is where we hear about mutinies, we hear about floggings going on. So again, we do have to recognize this was a very restricted society. And what happened at sea really had no authority to be challenged other than by going to the captain. So if the captain orders you to be flogged, it's not until you get back to shore that you could challenge that.
You know, there's an expression that sounds horrifying to me, somebody being keel-hauled. What was that all about?
So keel-hauled is the idea that you would basically be thrown under and kind of brought around and underneath the vessel. And if you think about these wooden boats, you would have had barnacles on them, so you can imagine the scrapings. It was not a particularly common practice. You were more likely to be flogged, and this is where you get the cat o' nines, which means every time I flogged you, you actually got hit 9 times. And so it was a brutal kind of punishment, but it was also done when we think about it as peer pressure. The idea of that one person being done to keep order. So again, it's a very rigid kind of structure that you are seeing on many, many of these vessels historically.
Hence, we had a few mutinies along the way.
Definitely. We definitely have mutinies. Probably the most famous that people are aware of is Mutiny on the Bounty. But again, we see these happening. This is where you see people being left behind on an island because they had mutinied. Some of the mutinies are successful, many of them are not, but it really kind of highlights that tension that's playing out between the crew, the officers, often the captain, who is not only in charge of the vessel, but he's often the representative for the owners. So there's a competition over, safety of the vessel, safety of your crew, and how much you can make. How fast can you get to a port? How fast can you get back to your home port?
So I've been on a lot of sailboats over the years, and whether I'm racing or not racing, if there's another boat near me, I want to sail faster. It's just human nature that you want to sail the boat as fast as you can. And I'm sure in these merchant vessels, and certainly the naval vessels, they wanted to perform and get their boat sailing faster than any boats that are in the area. Maybe they wanted to catch somebody, maybe they wanted to outrun them. So sailing the boat well had to be an important priority.
Definitely the skill level was quite critical, and what you see on these vessels is kind of different levels of skill. So at the very bottom would be your green hands. These are what we might call the landlubbers who have decided to go to sea, and they literally turn green because of that rocking world. But they're the ones who are just figuring out which way is port, which way is starboard. All of the different lines. When you look at these vessels, there are literally hundreds of lines that they have to know. Above them are the ordinary seamen, and this is going to be a role that sailors are in for years at a time. And this is where they have a little bit more than just the really basic knowledge, but they're working up to it. The most important sailors, though, were what we call the able-bodied seamen. These were the ones who knew literally everything about that vessel. They knew as soon as an order was given, or even as it was being given, what needed to be done. And that's what made those vessels successful, was the able-bodied seamen.
So the term green, people turn green when they get seasick. And I will tell you, I've sailed with a lot of great America's Cup champions, Olympic medalists. Everybody gets seasick at some point. Nobody is immune to doing that. But once you're out at sea for a while, you get over it. 2 or 3 days in, you're doing well, and I'm sure that's what happened there. So there's a lot of stories. You read Jack London and others about sailors that basically came up through the hawse pipe, I think the expression is, where they didn't know anything and they were green, and eventually become able-bodied seamen or mates or even captains.
Definitely, and again, there was lots of home remedies. So ginger was very, very popular. So this is the idea of ginger snaps, because if you keep ginger snaps in a sealed tin, they never go bad. And so a captain's wife would maybe give him a tin, and he could then sell it to the green hands, and it would be a way to make a little extra money on it. But it took years of learning to become an able-bodied seaman. And this is one of the kind of struggles there, because you need those years of experience. But this is also really physically demanding work. So the older you get, the more physically tough this is. And so you kind of see sailors capping out at the top end of their salary right in their early to mid 30s, because by then they have the skill, but physically they're starting to kind of get a little worn down on it. So there's a push and pull throughout this whole world.
And people didn't live that long during that era either. You know, if you were in your 40s, you were old. You know, now your 40s, you're just almost getting rolling. At least I certainly hope so. Well, I have to think that it all heightened up when you had a battle. Another ship came along and, you know, you're in the Royal Navy, the British, and oh my gosh, over the horizon comes a French vessel, and do we engage or not? And it must have gotten really serious at that point.
It is, and it's something to keep in mind, the question of, are you actively at war? Because this is the difference between it being a fair interaction and the question of, is this piracy? This is also the question of privateering, which was legalized piracy, which was a little questionable at times. But it's also, you know, the idea that you have to have absolute command. And this is why the captain was so important. He's important during all of these periods, but especially in times of conflict and during like bad weather. You need one person who is making these decisions, and it can't be kind of opened up to a democratic debate of what should we do next.
Well, you use that term weather. You know, sailing when it's blowing 12 or 14 miles an hour, nautical miles an hour, and the sun's shining and it's warm out, you couldn't have more delightful sport than sailing. But it's not always like that out there. Storms blow through and big waves happen, and then equipment breaks, and then people get injured and tired, and it can be tough out there at sea. So the question is, how do these sailors handle it when the weather turns adverse?
You know, they've got to keep doing their job. And this is one of the things to keep in mind, is they don't get to go, okay, we're going to take a little bit of a break and go inside. So you're going to continue to be climbing up, you know, the mast. You're going to have to think about, do you need to bring the sail in? And, you know, bringing the sail in means you're going to lose a little bit of that speed. So it's, again, a give and take between the safety of the vessel and the crew and the necessary speed for that particular moment. Sometimes we also have to think about, they're going to pray to the gods. Over, you know, do we need more wind? Do we need less wind? So this was the idea of like throwing money at the sails if you are becalmed, because you wanted to give the gods a little bit of their due, but don't give them too much, because then you end up with a hurricane. So it's also a very superstitious world that comes out of this.
I think a sailor's worst nightmare is being becalmed, sitting there in no wind. You can't go anywhere. You're searching the horizon and clouds for anything. And people don't like it. And there's a band, a part of the earth called the doldrums, that between the northern and southern hemisphere, where there's no wind at all, and it's hard to get through there.
And this was definitely the challenges, especially as we're seeing trade expanding, as you're getting into what's known as the age of exploration, which is 1400s, 1500s, going all the way into the early 1900s. But in this world of sail, getting becalmed could mean that you were going to run out of food, you were going to run out of water. It also meant you may get back and find out that there's no one to buy that cargo. Morale is going to be very tough. So again, this may lead more likely to mutinies, and we definitely do see mutinies happening in the doldrums, because there's that tension of, are we going to survive?
I was doing the America's Cup out in San Diego, and San Diego is generally not a windy place. You know, 8 to 12 knots is an average day. A big wind day might be 14 or 15 knots. And while covering it, I thought, you know, I want to do a documentary on the windiest part of the world. What is the windiest part of the world? And after a little bit of research, I figured it out. Cabo de Hornos, Cape Horn, at the bottom of South America. And this is where the Andes Mountains, which are roughly 18,000 feet high, these lows whip around the world, unimpeded by land. They can't get over the top of the mountain because the air is so thin, and they go around the bottom of Cape Horn, and it blows gale force winds one day out of every 4. And the stories are amazing of boats trying to navigate around the Horn and get from New York to San Francisco. And it must have been really tough. The stories about boats that spend weeks just trying to round the Horn because it was so windy.
I mean, this is definitely part of what you hear when you think back to like the mid-19th century and the gold rush, because the fastest way to get from the East Coast to the West Coast was by water. But you had to also go through this incredibly dangerous area. And so, you know, the question of not just how long was it going to take, but were you actually going to make it around successfully? And so again, that fight against Mother Nature is part of that story.
Well, I've been around Cape Horn 3 times, and it was windy, but not grossly windy. It was 25 to 30 knots, so it was a fresh breeze, but it wasn't debilitating. And after doing that documentary, I thought, maybe I could do something else. What could be more dramatic than Cape Horn? And I came up with Antarctica. And spent 6 weeks sailing the Antarctic Peninsula on a sailboat, a 54-foot sailboat, and it was fascinating to be down there. And you really got the sense of what New York looked like and what North America looked like, shaped by the glaciers, because that's what they have down there. And you could see it. The harbor right behind us here, that was all formed by glaciers. And not that long ago on the geological clock, only maybe 10,000 years ago, there were glaciers here.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you think about it, Long Island is very much made up from the glaciers. We only became an island literally an eye blink ago, 11,000 years ago.
Terminal moraine.
Yeah,
right?
Those glaciers that left Long Island roughly about 22,000 years ago very much shaped not only the island, but they flattened out like the Long Island Sound area and really kind of helped to shape it. And if you think about it, Long Island is also the remnants of the Appalachian Mountains. So we've definitely got a lot of geological history in this area.
I find glaciers fascinating. And the thing that surprised me in Antarctica is how loud these are. It's like thunder going off and fireworks that are cracking and exploding and all this noise going on. It's really something. And they're moving. I mean, they're basically gigantic rivers of ice that are going into the sea. And of course, the question now, are they melting faster than we want them to be?
I mean, this is definitely quite literally a hot question. But climate change is part of what we have to think about when thinking about this maritime world, and the fact that here in New York, as well as in many other parts of the world, we are coastal areas. We have, as humans, historically lived near coastal zones because of all of the benefits, whether we're thinking about food, like shellfish and fishing, but also transportation. Historically, it's always been easier to move goods and people over the water. And so, again, we have this very close connection to the water, even though we can't live in it.
I've done a lot of ocean racing, and when you do ocean racing long distance, you spend 4 hours on deck sailing the boat and 4 hours down below resting, eating, and preparing for the next time. And life down below, it's not always that nice. It's wet and sometimes uncomfortable, and it's loud. So I imagine life aboard these vessels wasn't so pleasant.
Absolutely not. First of all, it tends to be really damp. One of the first things I was told is that wooden vessels are always in the process of sinking because there's just no way to get the wood close enough. So you've got a dampness that is innate to these vessels. You also have to think about the size of the crew, and this really depends on what type of vessel it is. On a fishing vessel or on a merchant vessel, you want to have as small of a crew as possible because this all comes down to economics. And so that also means you want as few officers as possible because it's basically one officer per watch. But on naval vessels, as well as on pirate vessels, it's all about having a large complement because the sailing is kind of secondary in that sense. You want to have as many people as possible when you have conflict. And so, again, there's kind of a different setup depending on the type of vessel it is. But always it's going to be tight because on a cargo vessel, you want to give as little room to the sailors as possible and leave everything else open to make money. And then on the naval vessels, there's just so many people. So your bunk is probably likely to be shared. So when you're on watch, someone is sleeping in your bunk at that time. So hopefully you are not getting any of the lovely, little bugs.
Well, it's like that in ocean racers. If you're on watch for 4 hours, somebody's in your bunk, and you want to make sure that you keep it dry for that person. Don't get in with your wet foul weather gear because the next person's going to have a wet bunk, and then the morale starts to go down at that point. But what about the food on these vessels? I mean, we talk about scurvy. People like to eat fruit as best they could. I mean, food must have been a big issue.
Food was definitely an issue, and if we think about it today, food is very tightly wrapped around with morale when we think about it, but that was not going to be a morale builder on most vessels, especially those vessels that are at sea for long periods of time. So transatlantic vessels, ones that are, going over to Asia for trade. So you had a lot of salted meats. You also had a lot of what's known as hardtack. Basically take flour and water and maybe a little salt, mix it together, bake it, and then bake it a second time, and it was meant to be gnawed on. It wasn't something you ate in one sitting. You could either use it to dip into like some soup, or you'd kind of gnaw a piece off and stick it in your pocket. It did sometimes have a little extra protein added in it. You had weevils. So again, it's not necessarily the healthiest of food. Now as a captain, you would be living hopefully the much better kind of quality of food. Officers, especially on naval vessels, you might even have a couple of chickens and a pig on board to provide some fresh food. But that's why coming into a port was so important, because you could get fresh food. On smaller vessels or ones that were going more slowly for whatever reason, they may have some fishing going on. But again, this was not a life that was for everyone. Sailors were definitely, if we look at society, we're at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, and this was not a huge draw to say, hey, look at our food on board.
Wow. Well, I would like to be having dinner with the captain and not with the rest of the sailors down below. That would be a tough one. So I'm guessing that every now and then there would be some kind of illness that would come along that would go through the ship. I mean, somebody gets a cold on the train and you're sitting next to them and you get the cold, or on the airplane. So illness and not seasickness, but it must have been some debilitating moments on the board. What did they do?
Diseases definitely ran rampant because you are in that really kind of tight environment. Everyone is interacting with each other. You don't have great quality food. You're not necessarily living a good quality life of getting 8 hours of sleep every night. So typically the captain would often be the medic on board, and he might have kind of his pharmacy that he would have. We have examples of these if you go to various maritime museums, and they might have something like some cocaine in there. They also had mercury, so some really wonderful solutions. So sometimes the treatment was worse than the illness itself. You also have to recognize, not only do you have sailors on board many of these vessels, you also have passengers on board. So again, you have a lot of interaction. Plus, as they're going in and out of ports, they're getting exposed to diseases that they don't have any type of protection against.
Wow. I hadn't thought about that, but you show up in a part of the world and you don't have the immune system, which you might be naturalized where you live, but now you're in a place and you got sick. That must have happened a lot.
It did, and it is something to recognize that it was not unusual for a sailor to die at sea, whether it was from disease or from injury. This was simply a part of life, and historically, sailors were one of the most dangerous professions you could be in, for any number of reasons, including simply exposure to illness.
Well, I've read stories about you'll have a group out on the bowsprit, and a gigantic wave comes and just gets rid of 8 people that were on the bowsprit, and they don't go back.
You would have people washed away. You could be out on the bowsprit, or if you're on a whaling ship in the 19th century, you'd be dealing with sharks, so you might lose a limb. In that case, the most important person on board was actually the cook, because he was good with the knives, and you wanted someone who could slice very quickly and also then cauterize the burn. It is also something to recognize, if any of you are familiar with Treasure Island, and if you think about what that main character's role was, he was a cook because he had no leg. And so a lot of cooks ended up being sailors who had lost a leg at sea. It was a way, kind of, if we think about it, early workman's comp.
Oh, Captain Hook, right?
You have Captain Hook, you have Long John Silver from Treasure Island, and again, they often played certain roles.
Well, I think one of the most compelling stories that I've read over the years is Ernest Shackleton. He took an expedition down to the Antarctic Peninsula, got stuck in the ice, and they spent a long time down there, and it was unbelievable rescue, and he got everybody back.
I mean, that is actually really miraculous, between just the environment being so dangerous, the idea of the ice breaking, not being able to necessarily predict what the ice was doing, to the fact of the lack of food, the lack of quality of food, that you're going to get everyone surviving that trip. And there are so many incredible stories of survival, but they're also then kind of, seen as oppositional to how many deaths occurred as well.
Well, I think one of the intriguing things about the Shackleton story, he had a photographer on the boat. I think his name was Hurley, and he came back with these glass plates, these negatives, and these black and white photos so we could see them today. I mean, it's astounding.
It is amazing how much we have, and how, especially from, say, the 19th century going forward, how many artifacts there are. If you go up to like Mystic Seaport, that is our largest collection in North America. And they've made a point of kind of having all of these kind of bits and pieces and thinking about where is that story, whether it's the picture, the logbook like you talked about, the outfit that the whalers wore so that they would be seen. They even had sunglasses to protect themselves from that reflection. But it makes it much more real when you have those tangible objects.
Well, I highly recommend people go visit Mystic Seaport. There's so much, you can spend a couple days there with things. They commissioned me a few years ago to do a film on a couple named Irving and Electa Johnson, who had two boats named the Yankee, and they did 7 trips around the world with young people, ages 16 to 24. And they had some colorful people. Sterling Hayden, who we saw in The Grandfather, an actor, was the maid on the boat. And happily, they had cameramen filming movies, 8mm, of all 7 trips. So I made a film on the voyages of Irving and Electa Johnson, which is, I think you can probably find it on the internet, called Unfurling the World. Anyway, that is all found at Mystic Seaport. I'm Gary Jobson, and we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Tara Ryder. So let's shift gears here a little bit. You mentioned this a little bit earlier, that almost exclusively the crews and officers on these vessels were male. Now, I want to tell you a little stat that I'm quite proud of, that today, in the sport of sailing, we have absolute gender equity in sailing in the Olympic Games. 50% of the competitors are male and 50% are female, and there's exactly even medal opportunities for both men and women. And in a couple of the classes, we have what's called a mixed crew, 1 man and 1 woman on the same boat competing, and it doesn't matter who steers. That's up to usually you want the taller one out on a trapeze wire and the shorter steering. But anyway, we've come a long way than where it once was. Did any women go on these boats?
Women definitely have been on the boats. They have steered them, they have commandeered them, they have been passengers on them, but they were always a really, really tiny minority when we're thinking about working on the boats. Obviously, we know women have been passengers. We would not be here in the United States if women had not arrived on the Mayflower and all of those other, immigrant vessels coming over. There is no legal restriction anywhere in the world that said women could not go to sea. But we do have to recognize that the sailor's life wasn't for most men, definitely was not going to be for most women either. And you do have women who went, and you can go literally back to kind of mythology, and you'll hear about women who were Phoenicians and some of the early Viking shield maidens. We do have evidence of women sailors, even in the British Navy. Again, though, they would have had to hide their identity because this was seen as a masculine world. And so from the working perspective of being a sailor, that was seen as being a man's job. Women were back at home and hearth. But we do have women who went to sea. They often hid their identity, so this might have been binding their breasts, which would not have been seen as unusual, because if you think about it, a lot of times we often bind kind of our chest for back support. So sailors did do that, and there were kind of other ways. Short hair. They'd shave, but they could often pass as being younger. So again, kind of that passing a higher pitched voice, not quite yet having a beard. We do have some women that we've been able to track, and you see that they jumped ship quite a bit so that they kind of changed personalities. Most women that we know of were discovered either when they were about to be punished or if they got sick. So again, kind of a way to get out of that punishment. But we have in the British Navy, I know there's a record of at least 20 women who served during that time. We also have women, though, on board, as I said, as passengers. But in the 19th century, we actually have vessels that become known as hen frigates. And this was part of the whaling life, because whalers were going to sea, and a typical whaling voyage was 3 to 4 years. And so if you were a captain, so we have Captain Gary over here, does he necessarily want to leave his wife behind? And keep in mind, there might have only been 6 weeks for him to meet his wife, flirt with her, marry her. And now he's like, hi, I'm leaving for 3 to 4 years if I'm lucky. Now, depending on the woman, I might have been like, have a nice voyage. Or I might have been, this is the age of romance after all. I might have gone to sea with you. And what that would have meant was that these were vessels that typically had only one woman on board, the captain's wife. And it really came down to the captain, what her experience was going to be like. For some captains, they were very strict that the only person she was allowed to interact with would be her husband and maybe the first mate. Because there was a fear that she might mother the sailors and that they would not be strong men who could fight Mother Nature. Others, they had a little bit more flexibility, and there's a lot that's been written because we actually know a lot about these women because they did have a lot to do at sea, which meant they kept journals. And they wrote about everything that was happening. And that's one of the interesting things about the 19th century whaling period is we have such a detailed kind of catalog of what life was like at that period. But it definitely was not interesting. Imagine going to sea with your husband and 9 months later, you're about to have a baby. And guess who your OBGYN is? That would be your husband. So again, this was a very challenging life, but it was also an experience. A woman could come back to a place like Sag Harbor, New York, and be like, oh, I went to the Sandwich Islands and I was over, in China, and come back and have this very kind of cosmopolitan, worldly experience. And different women, some went for one time and some spent decades at sea with their husbands. So there's a really kind of varied experience here.
So the National Sailing Hall of Fame is doing their next induction this coming October, which is in Newport, Rhode Island. And one of the inductees is a woman, Eleanor Cressy. And she was quite a navigator of some renown, flying Cloud, the famous vessel, the Donald Mackay ship that she was on. So I don't know.
I was about to say, so in the middle of the 19th century, 1850s, she goes to sea with her husband. And what's interesting is this isn't simply a wife and a husband going to sea. She is the navigator for this vessel.
And it was tricky.
And
of course, they were trying to break a record, too.
They were trying to break a record, but this is also about making money, about how fast can you get from East Coast to the West Coast. These are what are known as the clipper ships, and it's all about speed and being able to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And there had been a prediction that if you'd be able to go from the East Coast, from New York to California, it would be 85 days. And literally after the guy said this would be like phenomenal, he also said you couldn't do it. And so they end up going to break, when she navigates, they break this record. They make it from New York to California in 89 days and 21 hours with her navigating. She will later break that record. She cuts like 13 hours, I think, off of it. And what's really interesting is that they were a team. This was not simply a by chance. This was her husband recognizing her skill set. She read about kind of all of the growing knowledge at that time about how to navigate, was interested in any of the ideas, whether they were scientific or fantasy, just to see what could be done better.
Well, the Cressy name in Marblehead, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, is an important name. I think there's a Cressy Park in Marblehead, and she has some descendants up in that area. There's a book, The Practical Navigator, written by Nathaniel Bowditch, which is, I'm sure you've spent some time on that book, and I have too. And we inducted Nathaniel Bowditch into the Hall of Fame, I think it was 2015. So at the National Sailing Hall of Fame induction, Nathaniel Bowditch's great-great-grandson is accepting the award on his behalf from his grandfather. He gets up and he says, you know, I probably would have been smarter if my great-great-grandfather hadn't married his cousin. I thought that was pretty colorful. But Bowditch had a big influence on navigation in the world, and the American Practical Navigator is still in use today. The academies have it as a required reading for anybody that's going to be on a bridge of a ship. And, you know, he was an important guy.
It's something to keep in mind. Navigation and how to get from point A to point B is in many ways much more modern than we have to think about. You know, we've used the stars as sailors for thousands of years, but the idea of being able to determine longitude is a very recent idea, the end of the 18th century, and the use of the sextant. But one of the challenges is most sailors were not literate, let alone understanding higher maths. And so part of the benefit that Bowditch provided was giving mathematical tables so that you didn't necessarily have to do tangents and all of that higher math that I don't know that I remember how to do. You kind of had a cheat sheet. But it is really fascinating because today we're all used to using GPS to navigate. But what happens when the electric goes down? And so the sextant is actually still a really practical tool, and we do see many of our modern navies actually teaching officers how to use it.
Well, I remember the horror of doing a Mercator projection problem where you start here and you end up there. What's the course and distance going to be? And you got to figure out. And there was tables that would help you, but the biggest mistakes were simply addition and subtraction. You know, you want to be really careful on how you did that. So you're off the ship. You're in lower Manhattan. You're feeling really good. You got a nice wad of cash in your pocket from the couple years you spent out at sea. And what do? You go off and get your more than your share of rum, and you have a night and you fall asleep, and you wake up the next day and you're on a vessel. You've been shanghaied. What is that all about? So
this is something to keep in mind, and this is a kind of process that has happened at different periods of time in different parts of the world. The earliest terms, kind of if we're thinking from an American and British viewpoint, is impressment. And this typically happened during times of war when there simply wasn't enough sailors joining the Navy at that time. And so if I need more sailors, I am going to literally go into these the seaports area, into what's often known as the red light districts, because sailors were known for being a little rowdy when they came ashore. They kind of got to break off all the rules. That structure they had at sea, they kind of threw off when they were back on land. And so they're going to spend their money. But where do I find sailors? Because if I want sailors for my British naval vessel, I don't want a landlubber. I don't want someone who doesn't yet know what port and starboard is and what all these different lines. I want an expert. I want a seaman. And so I'm going to wait until Gary has his rum and maybe a little bit more rum. And you know what, Gary? I understand. Let me buy you some rum. And they're going to literally get them drunk so they pass out. And the next thing, as you said, they're going to wake up on a vessel. And so this was the idea of press gangs wandering through. But we see it continuing even into kind of more modern times in the 19th century, especially when we're looking at this trade with Asia, where cargo was so valuable. This is pepper, this is silk, all of the spices. And that's where the term Shanghaied kind of came from, was that they were going to end up on a vessel going to Shanghai. With the impressment, especially with like the navies, typically they wanted to put you on a ship that was not coming back to your home port because it would be harder to jump ship. And so again, with being Shanghaied, you're going around the world, so you're not going to know anyone that's going to be able to help you. Of course, this was not great for morale, and I will say most officers preferred sailors who volunteered to be on their crews rather than those who were impressed or shanghaied, simply because they knew that they would jump ship as soon as possible.
It makes it a intriguing tale, though. that is for sure. Tara, it's been great talking with you. You have a encyclopedic knowledge of all things maritime, and thank you very much. And we'll look forward to continuing watching the tall ships go up and down the Hudson River and New York Harbor here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.